All right, here we are. Hello and welcome to the Viking Codecast. My name is Erik Trautman, and we have here with us Peter Hurford, who's a developer and data scientist and blogger and man of many talents and and much interesting experience to talk to us. Thank you, Peter. For anyone who's new to this is the Viking Codecast is something we're doing every week, where we bring experts from around the industry in to talk to our students and into the broader world about things relevant to development. So we cover a whole wide range of topics. It's really user driven. So essentially anyone who's outside and listening in is welcome to ask questions. You can ask questions on Twitter. You can ask questions in the event itself. You can ask questions. We have links to all these things in our newsletter, which comes out every week. So feel free to join that on the website. Otherwise, here we are. We are your captive audience. And I would actually, I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of your story. Where did you come from, and where are you now?
Sure. All right. So I've been programming for a really long time. I started programming actually around like age 9 or 10, when I was just like fiddling around with this thing called MicroWorks, where you basically just like move a turtle around the screen by like giving it commands. It's like a great thing for like a 9-year-old to do. And after that, I eventually graduated into building web pages, and I would like just like make sure to build a web page for every single person in my family, and like really bother them about it a lot. And eventually, I got into JavaScript games, and I got into like Adobe Flash games. Like I don't think anyone uses Flash anymore, but it was like really popular when I was like 13, 14. I was actually told never to put Flash experience on my resume. I was like really sad about that. I was like, I worked in Flash for like 3 years, and I like can't put this on my resume. Like, but people were like, yeah, Flash is dead. Like, don't put it on your resume. Anyway, but then I eventually got to college, and I took like a computer science class in college, and I was like, this is kind of interesting, but I'm not really sure I really like computer science after all. Like, I think I'm gonna do something else. Like, I was thinking a lot like, I just don't really enjoy coding and like doing what other people tell me to do. I always liked doing my own thing. And so I was like, this is really boring that I'm just like implementing the programs that other people are telling me to do. So I stopped doing computer science, and I went out and I became a political scientist. I got a degree in political science from Denison University. I also studied psychology, and I specialized in what's called political psychology, where basically you just like send a bunch of surveys to people to like figure out like what their political beliefs are and like why they hold them. I did research in particular about like your like friends that you have and like how they influence your political opinions. It was pretty cool. But then like senior year came around, and I was like, oh crap, I need to like actually get a job. And I looked it up, and there weren't that many jobs in political science. Like I could get like a PhD maybe, but I wasn't really feeling like going and doing like 7 more years of school. I got really interested in doing market research, because I did enjoy sending surveys to people, and like maybe I could get paid to send surveys. But none of the market research jobs were willing to hire me, like so I struck out a lot. And then I decided, like, I talked with some friends about like what I could do if it's not going to be market research, and they suggested that I like brush off my computer science, like try to give computer science a try. And so I got really interested in computer science. It seemed like a very in-demand field, particularly web development. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to try to get one of these web development jobs I keep hearing about. And I had like a bunch of friends who were doing web development, and they all suggested that like it would be a really good thing to do. Like the jobs are quite high paying. They're like not that hard to get. And like basically like I already kind of knew a lot of this stuff. Like I could just like kind of brush up and give it a try. So I decided to learn Ruby. I was told by like my friends that there were a lot of jobs in Ruby. And so I just kind of Googled basically like how to learn Ruby. And I started off doing like just a bunch of like Codecademy stuff, like online free tutorials. But eventually I found the Odin project, which the pair to the Viking Code School. At the time, the Viking Code School did not exist, so I was just doing the Odin project, but I really loved it. It was like so thorough and like detailed, and I just kind of did it all. Like I read like all the lectures and all the articles and did all of the projects, and I learned a ton of Ruby. And then like I started applying to internships. I just applied to the companies that my friends worked at. It especially helped that they could kind of give my resume a boost with like an internal referral. Kind of moves you through the process, especially when you don't really have a lot to prove yourself besides like some lessons you took online. Yeah, and then eventually I like did phone interviews, like did code interviews, and I got a job at a company called Avant. Avant's an online loan company in Chicago. We provide loans to people with near prime credit. It's like pretty similar to like Lending Club or Prosper if you've heard of those websites. Basically, just like go online, get a loan. It's a pretty profitable business. It's like definitely really booming right now, especially after like the 2008 recession when like banks were tightening up credit. I can talk a lot about credit risk if you guys are interested. Yeah, and then once I was in Avant, I had a 3-month internship, so I was like 3 months to prove myself. It was great because they were paying me money to learn rather than the other way around. And I like learned a lot every day, like doing full-time programming in Ruby. I'm working on the Rails app. And while I was doing my internship, I found out that there was a data science team that like really needed help with Ruby, and like they were like giving me a lot of tasks. At least at the time, we have a much more organized internship program now, but like 2 years ago when I joined the company, it was like very disorganized, and basically it was kind of up to the interns to like figure out what they should do. Like no one was really telling us what to do. So I basically just had to kind of go around and be like, do you guys have anything I can do? And the data science team was always like ready to give me stuff. Like they had stuff to do. So I ended up doing a lot of stuff for them. And then at the end of my internship, like I did well, and there was like the Ruby team was willing to give me a job offer so I could become a full-time Ruby developer, but also the data science team was willing to give me a job offer. So I actually chose to become a full-time data scientist. I thought that like I kind of fit better with my college experience as like doing psychology and political science, and I felt like it was just like more interesting. Like and the kind of questions you answer in data science just like seem a bit more interesting to me than the kind of questions that you answer as a Ruby programmer, even though those questions are like quite interesting. Also, I felt like the data science was like kind of a bit more of an in-demand field. So now I like program in Ruby very rarely, maybe like 10% of my time, and I spend like 90% of my time working in this language called R, language for statistical programming. And we at Avant kind of use R as like a full programming language, where like most people kind of use it more like just like a stats terminal. So I think that's kind of unique to Avant and what we do, and it's pretty cool. And so I just build a framework to basically where data scientists can build and deploy predictive models to like basically be able to estimate default risk. And we also do a lot of other kinds of analytics like marketing analytics and all sorts of stuff. But I really like my job a lot, and I think I've done quite well in my job over the 2 years. And it's all places like Viking Code School or the Odin Project where I guess you can get your start and do really well if you put in the effort. So yeah, that's really all I have to share about my story. I didn't really come here with any particular agenda or anything I wanted to push. I was mostly just wanted to take some questions and answer some questions. So I hope you guys have some questions, or else this will be kind of a short talk.
Yeah, I certainly have some, and for anyone who's watching, again, you're welcome to ask questions in let's see, you can do it in the Q&A app on the Hangout itself. You can do it in Slack if you're a student, or pretty much anywhere that we can hear you. You're welcome.
Shout really loudly.
Yeah. For me, I was kind of curious. It's interesting that you started from sending out political surveys and then you ended up going back into data science. Is there any link with that sort of playing with data that ended up circling you back?
I definitely think so. Because when I was doing playing with data, I did have to do like some statistical programming. We used a stats package called Stata. But like you do kind of like Stata kind of is a programming language where you're like basically you're like taking data in and you're like cleaning it up. You can kind of think of data as like a Ruby hash, where it's just like a hash of like arrays, and it's just like you kind of like have to clean stuff in that. So like some of the arrays may have like blank values, and you like want to switch those to real values or like delete them or something. And so like a lot of these like basic manipulations like you would do in Stata like are things you could do in Ruby. And so like that kind of like was reinforcing and like kind of reminded me of programming. And it also meant that I had a statistical background as well, kind of coming into data science, which is like really helpful. I guess like another really interesting thing is I think web development has like made me a much better data scientist. And the reason for that, I'll just kind of ramble on about that if that's okay, is that like a lot of data scientists don't really, at least in my opinion, they don't really understand code quality that well. Like they tend to write these like very, very long, like 800, 1,000 line scripts that like do all the data cleaning and all the modeling I was talking about. And then they just like, if you're lucky, they'll like put it on GitHub. They'll know what GitHub is. I knew people whose idea of version control was they would just email themselves the copy of the file. Every time they changed it, they would just reply to their email, and like that was their version control. Yeah. So you're lucky that like GitHub exists and you like know about GitHub, and you like can know about like breaking things up into like modules and like different files, different classes. You know about like writing tests so that if like things break, you're not just like spending hours like, I wonder which one of my 1,000 lines is like not working properly. You like have the automated tests. And so like a lot of these things, like everyone who programs Ruby like knows about these things. Like, oh, I should have like classes and like split things up and like write tests for them and like use GitHub. But like all these data scientists like have never heard of these things. So like if you kind of come into data science with this like Ruby background, you can like really like amaze people. And I think that's probably possible for other things too if you were to like become an accountant or something. Yeah, you just like bring in that like web development skills. They're like pretty good to have, just like ways of thinking about things.
So you mentioned when you got onto the job that you were sort of pulled in to do Ruby work with the data science.
Yeah.
I mean, Ruby and data science don't really always go together. I mean, typically you hear scientific computing and things like that. They use Python at the very most in terms of highest level languages. So what was that relationship where you guys needed to actually use Ruby and they needed
So at the time we had a team of 5 data scientists, and one of them knew Ruby, the other people knew R. But the problem was that all the data that they wanted was in a Postgres database that only the Ruby app originally had access to. So like we need this data to build our models, but we have like no real easy way of getting it. And this is like really slowing us down. Like they like write custom SQL queries to like try to query the database. So what I spent like basically the vast majority of my internship on was just like building nice APIs in the Ruby app that like they could call from R and like really speed up their workflow because it like gave them the data as the Ruby app understood it. It also meant that like all the business logic we had in the Ruby application that like kind of explained the data and like that they could use, like I could put into APIs for them to use. So it was just about like opening up the Ruby app like for the data scientists to be able to work with, rather than them like just kind of having to figure it out on their own. Yeah, it's very important to be able to work with the application where your data is at, or else like you're not going to be able to really build a good model.
John, I see you're unmuted, but we can't actually hear you.
Yeah, I just have a question on that last story in that. Like data science has been like super hot for like 5 years about, right? Yeah. And that story that you just told just has a little bit. I don't want to disagree or anything, but it just has a little bit of an era of like back in the day with like the emailing yourself, the source code, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Do you feel like that's like a current pathology in data science, that those sorts of like really obviously bad source control practices and that sort of thing, is that going on now, or is that something that was like back in the day?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say I think data science has gotten a lot smarter over the past couple of years, and then there's no longer people using email for source control, and like people have kind of wised up to GitHub. But I think a lot of the things I was talking about, like code quality wise, is like still a huge problem. Like automated testing. So like I go to R conferences a lot, and like a lot of the conferences, like automated testing is kind of still like a new edgy thing that like people don't really use very often. And like people still are writing those like very long, like 1,000 line scripts. and like that hasn't stopped at all. Like so being able to like organize data science is like still I think a huge like I mean we figured it out at Avant. I'm sure like other companies have like figured it out as well, but it still seems to be like a huge opportunity.
So maybe more specifically, one follow-up, and then I'll just shut up for a while. But like, do you feel like somebody who has like, just kind of a generic quant background of some kind, and like has enough experience with things like self-control and release cycle and build process and that sort of thing, would really come into the game and necessarily like have like obvious added value in the data science community or to a data science team?
I think so. I mean, you'd have to be able to sell that to the data science team. And I'm going to say that I don't really know a ton about various data science teams because I don't have like a ton of work experience yet. But I do know that like we do hire a lot of people with quant backgrounds. Like that's a pretty popular background for data science, is like having that previous quant or trading or previous finance background. And like having good developer hygiene is like definitely very helpful. And I guess it really depends on what the team is looking for. I imagine like when you're getting the job, what you really need to do is like maybe more sell your like statistical expertise and like how you're going to actually contribute to the bottom line. And then when you're on the team, you can like really establish value by like being able to like bring in sane developer practices and like organize things. And I'm not saying that's like a tried and true method. It's just like an opportunity that I see. I have like no idea how that's like actually going to play out in like the real world or in companies I don't work at. Maybe they'll just get like really mad that you like want to change all their stuff.
Well, so you mentioned this idea about developer hygiene. Do you mind kind of diving a little bit into that? Like how do you define that, and what does that mean for someone to have developer hygiene? Yeah.
So basically, like, so you're writing code, and like the idea is that the computer knows exactly what you're doing and like knows how to execute it. But the problem is that the computer isn't the one writing the code. Like, it's that other people that you work with like need to be able to read your code and like understand like what you meant. And this is actually like a big problem because code is really hard, and you end up writing these like huge messes that like no one understands. And worse yet, like sometimes I write things and then like 5 months later I come back to it and like I myself like have no idea what it is that I did because it's just this like huge unorganized mess. And it's like, oh, like what does this object do? Like what does this method do? Like how do I do that? Like I can't tell just by reading it. So like developer hygiene is this idea that like you make your code like actually like readable to humans and not just to computers, and that when you come back things are organized in a way that like you actually understand what like this large complex thing is doing. And so I imagine you like maybe you probably cover this in your curriculum, things like single responsibility principle or law of Demeter. Like there are a lot of these like buzzwords or great practices that you can have that like really help like just make your like if you follow these practices your code's like a lot more readable and understandable. I think just like having really good documentation is also like very underrated way of like making things easier to understand. Yeah.
So a lot of times I feel like there's a pretty big difference between reading about something like the solid principles you're just talking about in a book and then actually learning how to apply them in your code. How did you make that distinction? How did you make that go to the point where you feel actually comfortable like you're applying these kinds of things in your daily life?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is really just like practice. Like I read all these things in a book too, like before I got a job, and I showed up at my job and I'm like, I know all these things, like I know what solid is. And then I wrote code and it was like still like really crappy and terrible and not actually solid or whatever. And I had a bunch of coworkers who like knew way more than me, and they're like, hey, like this code's like pretty unreadable mess. Like this isn't solid, or like this method, like this function's doing like 6 different things, like single responsibility principle. And I was like, oh yeah, right. Like I remember reading about that. Like that's really important. So I'm gonna just like refactor my code. And then so like there's like a lot of practice. I also like when I was on the job, I like kept reading a lot of books. I kept watching lectures by this woman named Sandy Metz. If you guys like, probably she's really good, really important. It's like just doing what Sandy Metz tells me to do. and and like I just like learned a lot of these things. Just like, and I'm still learning now. I'm still making a lot of mistakes and getting them corrected. I mean, now I'm also like helping correct other people's mistakes too, which is like another way of learning things. Yeah, just get a little better every day, I guess.
Speaking of getting a little better every day, we have a question from the app.
Yeah.
Are you able to see that?
Yeah, I guess, so I read it like, "Hi Peter, great story. You have a solid basis in college already, so did a job in this environment feel like a big leap? I've done a boot camp and self-taught and college courses for Ruby and Java. How else can I prepare?" Uh, yeah, so I do think it kind of did feel like a big leap. Like, I mean, I kind of moved from programming maybe like 3 hours a day to programming more like 9 hours a day. And I moved from working on my own repositories where I was like, oh, I was making like a tic-tac-toe game, and like my repository had 100 commits and like maybe like 5 classes or whatever. And now I'm like working on this like gigantic Rails app. It has like 60,000 commits. It has like 300 like controllers, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is like this thing. Like, how does anyone understand like what's going on here? It's like very complicated. And I mean, like I have to like produce code for other people and not just like myself. Like that was a huge shift. I guess like how you can prepare. Like I guess, I mean, most jobs are going to understand that like if you like don't have prior work experience, that like you're not going to really like come in like hitting the ground running, and you're going to need some lead time. And I found that like a lot of companies are like willing to kind of give you the training that you need, and like willing to be gentle with you about that, and not like expect like what you're not capable of. So like you'll get a lot of chance to just like learn while you're in the job, and you don't have to be like, oh my gosh, like I've never contributed to a repository with like 60,000 commits, like how am I going to survive? If you really want to prepare for that, I guess you could also try to contribute to open source projects. Like you could like read through the Rails code base or something, or read through the Angular code base. And even if you're not like making pull requests with amazing new features, you can basically like, Rails is a really huge code base. It has like tens of thousands of commits. Like you could read through it and try to understand what it does. And like you're getting practice like reading these very large repositories. And like if you can understand the Rails code base and what's going on, you can probably understand like any code base. I mean, it helps that Rails is a really nice code base. So maybe you go to a job and they have a really crappy code base, but yeah, like you can do things like that. I definitely think it's possible to like teach yourself how to do these things, and like you get a lot of on-the-job learning as well.
So you're talking about on-the-job learning, and also in the question there was an element of sort of the pre-job stuff. How do you connect the dots?
Yeah.
Do you mind talking a little bit more specifically about how you wrestled up an internship without actually having a CS degree?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, there definitely is. So like when companies are looking for interns, I think they definitely are looking for people with CS degrees. So like you kind of come into the internship, and you already know that you're sort of a bit of a long shot, so you kind of need to prove yourself. And I think there are definitely steps you can take to prove yourself. And some of those things are like, I mean, there's like kind of hard skills. Like you can point like, hey, this is my GitHub account. Like these are my projects. Like this is my like fully functional Twitter clone. Like this is my like fully functional tic-tac-toe. Like here's a like tic-tac-toe bot you can play against. And like here's the code, and you can like see that it's like pretty good for somebody right out of college. And a lot of companies are going to see that, and they're going to be like, hey, this guy like actually knows what he's doing. Like his code's not great, but it's like pretty good, and he seems really interested in learning. He's like very excited in the interview. He did pretty well on our like practice test or whatever, and like we're willing to give him a shot. I think it really helps that the business is booming. Companies are basically like they're trying to hire as much as they can, and when they like see you like, oh, I'm Tish, I'm applying for a job, they're not going to be like, oh, well, Tish is competing against these 100 other people for this like one spot. Like let's see how well Tish does. Actually, what it seems to be the case in most companies is that like they're just trying to hire as many people as they possibly can, and it's really just like you competing against like their like arbitrary skill threshold, and it's like, oh, Tish looks good enough, like we're willing to give her a shot. And so like the competition's not that high. I mean, it's not like low, but it's not high. And you don't have to do a ton to prove yourself for like an internship position, especially if you have like a nice GitHub, you have a resume, you can like point people to projects. On the interview, you can like talk about your projects and like how you went about doing them. On the interview, you can like answer trivia questions about Ruby. So they might ask you like, hey, what's the difference between a proc and a lambda? And you are going to say like, I actually like really don't know. It's a pretty technical question. But like I guess there's not a ton of difference between a proc and a lambda, but prefer to use lambdas. I know what a lambda is. Yeah, anyway, you probably want a different question. Maybe like, what's the difference between a symbol and a string? And you can be like, oh, well, a symbol is only represented once in memory, and if you like instantiate the symbol multiple times, it like only is like one part of the memory, but if you like instantiate the string multiple times, it like takes up many different memory addresses. I'm not very good at Ruby questions anymore. I like forgot all my Ruby as I started learning R. I'm very good at R interview questions, if you want to ask me. And I actually do interview people for my like job. Like I actually make hiring decisions these days, so I can give you like cutting edge interview tips or like tell you what it's like interviewing other people.
Go on.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like the way we do interviewing at Avant, like so this is just like just one company, but I think it's pretty standard. Is like, so you want a job for an Avant. At Avant, you can kind of go two ways. You can apply through our job portal, or you can have an internal referral. An internal referral is basically like when I'm like, oh, my friend, like this is my friend, he's a pretty good guy, I'll vouch for him, he wants to work here. And those kind of are like fast-tracked, whereas jobs portal, you basically sit in a database with like 100 other people, and you can like it usually takes you a couple weeks before somebody gets around to seeing your application. Whereas internal referrals like are instantly seen. So it's definitely great if you like have a friend working in another company and you can be like, hey, can you get me that internal referral? And like put my resume in the special pile. Like that's definitely a very good way to start out. And that's how I started out. I think it was pretty important for my job to like have that kind of internal referral so that like I don't just get filtered out like, oh, this guy doesn't have a CS degree, like pass. So that definitely helps.
So,
then,
okay, yeah.
I was just going to keep going through the interview process, but if you have specific questions, I could.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned that the internal referral process is vastly superior to just pumping and dumping your resume out on a bunch of job boards, and that's absolutely something that we found 100 times. So you on the other side, you're the developer in the chair making decisions and reading some of these things.
Yeah.
How does somebody from outside in the world who doesn't know you personally connect with you and actually make you take notice to the degree where you might actually say, oh, well, this person let's give them a shot through the internal process, not through the job board process?
Yeah. So the biggest one is like people I went to college with, just like are my personal friends, like so I know them pretty well. But I mean, none of you guys went to college with me, so I guess you're out of luck on that one. But another one is like I've had people like so like I have a personal GitHub account. It has repositories on it. We have a company GitHub account, like github.com/AvantCredit. We have like a lot of open source repositories there too. Sometimes people like make commits to them or like file issues or something, and like we definitely really notice that like, oh my gosh, like this like never happens. Maybe like 4 times a year or so, like somebody will actually file an issue or commit to our repository, and you bet that like within an hour of that happening, we're like crawling through their GitHub, crawling through their LinkedIn, like is this guy legit? Like he just contributed. Like we kind of get a little giddy. So that's another way like we really notice people. It's like, oh my gosh, like they noticed us. Like we're gonna crawl all the way through, see what they're up to, maybe try to reach out to them. Yeah.
That's actually a phenomenal tip.
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, if you like you Google me like Peter Hurford, you see that like, oh, I have github.com/Peter Hurford. I've got maybe like 30 repositories there. Hopefully some of them are like kind of interesting, and especially if you're really into R. If you're not really into R, I guess they're not that interesting. and you like try them out, and like something broke or something, you can just like file a quick issue, like, oh, this broke. Like it didn't take that much work to see that something could have been improved, and like maybe you could even make a pull request or something. Yeah, I would definitely 100% notice that and like be super inclined to like get that person an interview.
That's great. It sort of it not only provides a way of cutting through the noise and you know reaching out to people who are in these companies, but also
Yeah.
it also helps illustrate the importance, I think, of having that online vapor trail that
Yeah.
leads to you. Because if
Or
you
like,
guys are, go ahead.
yeah, another thing is like, so you look through my GitHub and you see that I like have certain repositories. You could just like send me an email like, oh, hey, I saw that you were doing blank. Like I've been doing this that's like pretty similar. Like, what do you think? Like, or like maybe just like ask for advice. Like, do you have any advice on how I could do this better? Or like, oh, I was running into like this particular problem on my repository and I see that you solved it this way. Like, can you tell me a bit more about like that solution or something? Like my email address is not hard to find. Like I think that's true for most people, and I love getting emails. Okay.
Well, that's great tips. Does
Yeah.
anyone have any questions off of that, or in general? I guess it could be a non sequitur too.
Yeah, sure. And I'm also happy to keep talking about the interview process if you guys want me to keep rambling on about what those steps are.
Yeah, I had a quick question. So like I know not all companies have like are open source or
Yeah,
have repos. Is there any tips on how to approach that? Because it seems to be a very like closed door kind of thing, other than networking and that sort of thing.
yeah. I know that there are like some very private closed source companies. Yeah, so for those, yeah. And if you don't know anyone in that company, I guess you do kind of have to network. Like most people aren't like private about what company they work at. So like if you use LinkedIn and you just type in the name of the company you want to work for, you're going to surface people that you could potentially then Google for, and like maybe they don't have anything open source for their company, but they like do open source stuff on the side. I guess there's probably I mean, I never really got into like networking things, but you could like go to meetup groups. If you like happen to be in a city with like a lot of programmers, like you can just see like, do they have a Ruby meetup group in your city? Like go to meetup.com, type in Ruby. I mean, yeah, if there's like a Ruby meetup in my hometown of Cincinnati, there's probably a Ruby meetup in a lot of random cities. And like you just go there, and there's going to be lots of people there who like are specifically there to recruit. Like I go to Ruby meetups specifically to find people to recruit for Avant. I mean, the thing is like, and you guys really want jobs, but the thing is companies also really want talented people to work for them. And so like we're going to make an effort to try to find you as well. So like if you're going to meetup groups, like we're going to try to find you. If you're like doing awesome stuff on GitHub, like we're going to do our best to try to find you. Like one of the things I was working on like was just trying to like trawl through all the people who like are on GitHub and like have their city as Chicago where Avant's located, and like try to look through their stuff and like basically like, can I find anyone interesting on GitHub that I want to talk to? Because I really want to like try to find talented people so that I can hire them. Yeah, like I guess companies are about as desperate to hire you as you guys are desperate to get hired. And you can really play that to your advantage.
That answer your question, Andrew?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, meetup groups.
I had a quick question as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned that when you first got started as an intern, they didn't really have a really ironed out intern program. You kind of had to find your own work.
Yeah.
I guess starting out in a completely entry-level way, what kind of work can you find yourself? Like when you're completely new to a code base, when you're new to the profession in general, I guess. What kind of things were you able to hop on and contribute to right away?
I guess like when I was in Avant, like pretty much any company like wants to do a lot of things, like a lot more things than they have people able to do. So they're gonna like work on their like high priority projects, and they're going to like deprioritize these things that are like nice to have, but like not critical. And like a lot of people are going to have like pretty long lists of like, oh, these are all the things that would be great to do, but we just like don't have the capacity to do them. And so like you can just go around and be like, what are the things that would be really nice to have that you like don't have the capacity to do? And they'll be like, oh yeah, it would be really great if somebody could like make an API that like does blah blah blah. And you can be like, well, I can do that. Yeah, and like kind of work from there.
Gotcha. And actually, one more thing. Again, getting started, you said you jumped around from a lot of languages. Started with Ruby, jumped to R. Before you were working with Flash things. I guess how long does it usually take you when transitioning to something new to feel really comfortable? Because you do have a lot of basic design principles that don't change from language to language. How long does it take to really get comfortable in a new role, I guess?
I would say right now it takes about a month to get really comfortable with a new language. When I started out, it would definitely take a lot longer. You're right that like languages don't. I mean, like a lot of languages are very similar to each other. Like the developer hygiene is going to be the same. Like the idea of like a function is going to be the same. Like every language is probably going to have something like a hash or a dictionary or like an array. Like all these things are just like maybe they'll like notate it differently, but they're still the exact same concept. So like once you've really mastered it, languages on a conceptual level, it's like not hard to switch languages. So like if you get really, really good at Ruby and you like spend like a year or 2 years like working in Ruby, eventually you'll just like have also happened to learn so many concepts that you can just like, oh, I can just like quickly pick up Python or Java, like, oh, these other object-oriented languages. I already know what objects are. I know what private and public classes are. Like they're the same things in Python and Java, even though they're notated differently. And so like basically once you learn like 2 or 3 languages very well, like you can just start learning any language in like a month or less, and then you can like know like 20 languages or something if you really want to. I see a question from Tish. Would you laugh if you saw my lab projects up on GitHub? I mean, I have no groundbreaking projects, but I see the need to be active there. No, I wouldn't laugh. I think that's actually a good idea. I think like just so few people that I see actually have anything on GitHub at all, that like seeing anything on GitHub open source is like pretty cool. I mean, you want to like pay like some attention to like are they going to like have any idea what you're doing? So like maybe like writing a nice README or like commenting your code. I don't know like what kind of lab project it is. Like if you're talking like particularly about like, oh, like this is the precise mitosis of this like some random thing, and like the code is like impossible to read, and like no one has any idea what that repository is about, maybe it's best to leave it off or work hard on cleaning it up first. But I think that could be a good idea. It shows that you like are interested in learning and like interested in GitHub, and that's always a good thing to show.
Cool. Yeah. What other questions do you guys have?
Anything else?
Yeah, I have a quick question. What are some good things to look for in a like when you look at people's GitHubs, profile accounts and their repos? Like what you did mention, like having a nice repo, but when you go into their code, like do you look at how they comment and other things?
Yeah.
Are there other like metrics that you look for specifically?
I mean, when I look at a repository, I'm usually like it's kind of like reading a resume. Like I tend to read it pretty quickly. Like spend maybe like at most like 5 minutes like poking through it. And I'm really looking for that kind of like developer hygiene stuff that we talked about. So like when I look at code on GitHub, I want to look at it with the understanding that it's not like they polish this up and are submitting it as like a professional code sample or something. Like I know it's their personal project, and like they it's not like fair to use it as like the sole determinant on like whether they're a good programmer. And like maybe they wrote it like 3 years ago or something. But like it's good to know like basically like how well documented is it? Like do they have tests at all? And if they do, like are they reasonably good tests? Like, is it just like one gigantic file that basically, like, can I read? Like, if I pick a file at random, like, can I read it and understand what it's doing? And I mean, this is something you can just like grab a developer friend, maybe someone else in your Viking code school, and be like, hey, like, this is my GitHub repository. Like, can you like spend 5 minutes like understanding what it does? And if they're like, no, I'm completely clueless what your repository is doing, like, then maybe you might want to put a bit more time into cleaning it up. But like, let's say if I look through your GitHub and like I see a repository and I'm like, I have no idea what this guy is doing, I'm not going to be like, therefore I'm not hiring him. I'm just going to be like, oh, he just doesn't get any bonus points for having a good GitHub. Like, I see kind of GitHub as just like extra credit. I'm not going to be like taking off marks. If I want to know whether you can code well, I'm going to ask you for like a specific code sample, or I'm going to give you like a coding challenge. And so like basically I would send you over email like, hey, like, I want you to make this specific thing, and like give you detailed instructions about what it does. And then you send me over email like a zipped Ruby file that like does what I want you to do. And that's what I'm going to be looking at and be like, oh, this guy knows how to code, or this guy doesn't know how to code. So like looking at the GitHub is just like extra credit that can like make the difference, but I'm not going to like hold it against you if your like lab assignment is too hard to read. So yeah, like, don't like freak out about like, oh my gosh, I have stuff on my GitHub that is from 4 years ago, and like Peter's not going to have any idea like what I'm writing.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Any other questions out there? Cool. Well, so I think one of the ones that I had was you'd mentioned about the transition from Ruby to R and what it takes to get comfortable with a new language. I'm kind of curious, like, when you knew that you had to start picking up R, how did you actually approach that learning process?
Yeah.
And what were the tools that you used?
Yeah, so no one made an Odin project for R, unfortunately. But so the way that I learned R was I had coworkers who knew R. So I basically just asked them like, hey, how did you learn R? And they told me, they basically, like, everyone recommended this like particular textbook that apparently everyone uses to learn R. It's called Advanced R by Hadley Wickham. So I like went through that book and it was pretty good. There were like some Coursera classes on R that I took as well. But basically, you like basically just kind of Googled like how to learn R, and like tried to find resources that like seemed plausible to me. Like, oh, like this actually looks like it'll teach me something. And like I just asked around, like, what resources do you guys recommend? And then I like put in the time to like actually go through those resources. Right now, I kind of like learning, like doing these things like where you learn by example. Like, there's a lot of things like, oh, I want to learn Clojure. So I like type Clojure by example, and like there are a lot of websites that's like, this is how you do it in Python, and this is how you do it in Clojure, and this is how you do it in Ruby, and you can like be like, okay, well, I mean, if I want to do this in Ruby, it's like this in Clojure. But that's kind of like a much more advanced way of learning that like is really only available to you when you like really know the concepts on a fundamental level, and then like you can just see how they're translated. But like for the first couple languages you're learning, you really kind of just need to start from scratch by like nice textbooks and stuff.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, online tutorials, Coursera.
So we kind of derailed you a little bit
Yeah.
when you're talking about the interview process.
Oh, yeah.
The hiring process.
Maybe
So-
that's like, yeah. So I guess like, yeah, we talked a lot about the internal referral initial stage, the Googling around and stuff. Basically, yeah, so like you apply and like we're basically deciding like, is this person like legit or not? And like right at this point, like we're going to then like do a phone call. And so we'll call you up on the phone, and like at that, and then we'll just like chat with them. Like I'll just chat with the candidate to like get a feel like what's their background, like what are they interested in, like what do they know about Avant the company, like why do they want to work here, like what do they want to get out of their job while they're here. And I'm asking them like some coding questions like, I'm not asking them like what's the difference between a proc and a lambda, like that comes later. I'm asking them like going through their GitHub and being like, oh, like I see you did this, like can you tell me like how you went about doing it? Or like, oh, I see on your resume that you have experience in this, like can you tell me about that? Like kind of like open-ended questions, just getting them to chat about technology. And like I just want to see like basically like, do they sound knowledgeable? Do they sound interested in Avant? Like, do they like care about us, or are we just like one of 1,000 places they're applying to and they really don't care? It's good. A pro tip is to at least be able to pretend convincingly like you care about the company. You want to make them feel special, even if maybe that's like not true. Like you can just kind of pretend enough, and so like pretend to be interested in the problems they're solving. And like basically on the phone, I'm just trying to see like basically, have you done at least one thing in your entire life that is like non-trivial? Like basically, is there anything you've ever done in your life that like I couldn't just do in like an evening? And like for a fair amount of applicants, like that's sadly not the case. Like they're kind of boring. But like a lot of people have done like something special, and maybe it's like on their resume or on their GitHub, or they talk about it on the phone. And as long as you've done like one special thing, as far as I'm concerned, like you can move on to the next stage. And then
do you mind kind of fleshing that out a little bit, like the kinds of things that you're thinking of there? I mean, I and probably everyone else has some sense in their minds of maybe what that might be, but in your experience, can you just speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, so I guess like class projects, or I mean, if you're right out of college, like class projects. If you're not right out of college, like things you've done in previous jobs. I guess like concrete examples, like oh, like if you made a like Twitter clone, like that's pretty cool actually. Like that's like not easy to do, and it like shows good grasp of Rails and Ruby. It's like a bit formulaic and trite, sure, but it's like still pretty interesting. Maybe you could like spin it out, like be a bit more creative. Like a lot of like the final projects for like pretty much any final project I've ever heard of for a boot camp like fits into this description. Like I guess like things that like it's not like, oh, I built like a calculator that can add like 5 and 3 together and give you 8. It's like, oh, I built this thing that's like elaborate. It has like I guess like 50 commits or something. Like basically shows that you like put in a lot of effort, and it's like not like somebody could have just done it like in a weekend, or like you actually had to put in effort. It's a bit hard to actually come up with good examples of this. Like I remember somebody made like a pretty cool thing that like took posts from Reddit and like displayed them as like a grid, and you could like see the images or something like from r/funny. And like it was like, and then if you like hovered over them, they like got big on your screen, so you could like read them. Like that was really cool. And like I couldn't just do that in a weekend. Yeah.
Thanks.
No problem. I hope does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
We have a number of people here who are going to be thinking about final projects pretty soon. So good.
Yeah. So yeah, if you have a final project, you can you can talk about it and sound excited and like tell me how you did it. I think like a lot of the phone streams I have, like I talk with them like, oh, you did this cool class project. Like I'll be like, why did you decide to do this and not that? And they'll tell me like, oh, the professor just told me to do it that way. And I'll be like, well, that's a bad answer. Like that shows like no like original thought, like no ability to like do things on your own, like no understanding of like even why did your professor tell you to do it that way, and like I'm like not going to be very excited about that person. But if they can be like, oh yeah, I chose to go with Postgres instead of SQLite because like I wanted like the additional capacity for more columns, and like even though it like is harder to run locally, like it runs much better on Heroku, and like I wanted to host my project on Heroku. And like Heroku doesn't really like SQLite. I'll be like, yeah, that's a really good answer. Like it shows that you understand the choices that you're making, and like you can talk about technology. Like awesome. Like that's the kind of people I want to work with. Yeah.
Solid.
Yeah, so if you get past that phone screen, we then usually give you a code challenge. And this is like a very well-defined problem for you to solve in Ruby or any language of your choice. And you get like a time frame, like usually like 3 or 4 days in which to solve the problem and like send your solution back to us. And we then have a bunch of people look over your code that you submitted and like be like, is this good code? Like, first of all, did they solve the problem? A surprising amount of people actually don't succeed at solving the problem. Or like they give you code and you run it and it crashes. If your code that you submit for the code challenge crashes, you're probably not going to get a job. So please make sure your code actually works.
That is definitely something we emphasize quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm very surprised at the amount of code challenges I get back that don't actually work. So a surprisingly easy way to distinguish yourself from the pack is just to write code that works. Yeah, that's all it takes. And so code that works, and code that I can read and understand. And I mean, it's nice like if you can use a lot of the cool tricks that Ruby has. Like instead of writing like a very long like do loop, you can use like .map or .each or those like cool Ruby shortcuts. Like that's really awesome if you can like clean up your solution that way. Like those are big points. I assume you guys learned that. Yeah. So you use those tricks that you learn in your code. And then like if you like a lot of people. Very few people like write tests for their solutions. So that's another very easy way to distinguish yourself. Is just like code up a really quick test suite. Like that's super impressive. Yeah, and another very easy way to distinguish yourself is just like writing tests for your solution. And so like and then like if you make any strange choices, you can like just write quick comments that explain like why you made that choice. A lot of people. Like when you write comments, you kind of want to comment like why you're making choices, not like what choices you're making. So you don't like be like, oh, like this is a like while loop. Like I know it's a while loop. It like says while in the code. Like I don't need you to comment that to tell me. But if you're like, oh, I chose a while loop here because I want to like do this and this, like that's kind of cool to know like from the comments. Yeah. So that's the coding challenge. And then after that, it's an in-person interview. And this is the one that's for all the marbles. Like, you show up in person at the office. You like interview with 5 different people, and they're going to ask you like kind of a mix of like just questions that you got on your phone screen, like why do you want to work here? Like what are you interested in? What are you expecting to get out of your job? And then like actual trivia questions, like can you solve this? Like, oh, I'll just give you a problem. Like maybe I'll be like, hey, can you write me a function that like gives me all of the even Fibonacci numbers below 4 million or something, and then you would like just write it out for me on a sheet of paper or on a whiteboard. It's surprisingly stressful to code on a whiteboard. That like you should practice that specifically if you don't already, because it's like just like very different from like typing on your keyboard. And a lot of companies do whiteboard coding for some apparent reason. And then sometimes we ask trivia questions like what's the difference between a proc and a lambda, which I'm totally going to Google after this is done because I personally do not know the answer.
Nice. So what's the difference between a sort of medium, not that interesting level candidate in terms of their answers to those questions and someone who really blows you away?
Which questions? Like
more of the technical, the whiteboarding type of questions.
Yeah.
The ones that you're really putting a lot of weight to.
Right. Yeah, so I think the whiteboarding questions are where people put a lot of their weight. I mean, different people at Avant, like different people just have different interviewing styles. Like we don't have a ton of standardization. And I imagine that's true at other companies too. So like the weight that I put on things might be different from the weight that my coworker does. And at the end, like you're just kind of getting like, I mean, I think all 5 of us have to say that like you're in for you to get in. And if any like one person doesn't like you, then you like don't get the job. So that's like a bit tough. But like so like what am I looking for on a whiteboard challenge? Like one that they like successfully answer the question, like that it works again, and that 2 that they like know basically that they know how to code, that that they don't just like freeze up and like be like, I don't know how to solve the question. They don't need like a ton of hints like as to what the right answer is. Basically, they can just like sit and think about it. Oh, another really good thing is that they ask questions like, oh, like I know that you wanted me to like sum all the even Fibonacci numbers under 4 million. Like, do you want me to like be able to just like hard code the 4 million number, or do you want that as like a parameter in a function? And then they'll be like, do you like basically like kind of just understanding like what are the inputs and outputs that you need to make, like kind of making it a very concrete, like if there's any uncertainty at all, like you definitely should ask the question to clear it up. Like questions are free, you can ask as many as you want. Another thing is like being able to explain your decision process, like instead of just like silently thinking to yourself and then like writing on the whiteboard, if you can be like, okay, so I know that a Fibonacci number, like I know that the Fibonacci sequence starts like 1, 1, 2, 3, and then it's just the sum of the previous two. And so like I can write that out on the whiteboard. And I know like, okay, first I need to, before I can sum all the even Fibonacci numbers, I need something that can like generate Fibonacci numbers. So first I'm going to write a function that does that. Yeah, so basically you just like explain your process. And after that it's like code quality, like doing things like rather than just writing like one gigantic function that like calculates Fibonacci numbers, finds the even ones and sums it, like if you can make like 3 different functions, like one, like, oh, this function is single responsibility is to like get me the Fibonacci numbers. This function's single responsibility is it takes in an array of numbers and it returns only the even ones. And like this function's single responsibility is just like take an array and like return the sum of all the numbers in the array. And then like I use all 3 of those functions to like get all the even Fibonacci numbers under 4 million. Like that's about as good as it's gonna get in that like one particular question. Like that's really awesome, and you're like explaining your thought process and you're asking questions about the question, like what I'm asking you to do. Yeah, like that. If you do all those things, so few people do. That would blow me away.
Then you win. You get the job.
Yeah, you get a job.
Cool. Do you have any? I know we're kind of getting to the end here. Do you have any final tips, either on the interview process, the learning process, or anything along those lines that looking back, if you were in the shoes of someone who's on this side of it, kind of pushing through but not quite there yet, that you give yourself?
Yeah, I think like what's the biggest advice I want to give myself, like back when I was like, oh, I really want my first job, I don't have this CS degree, no one's gonna hire me, like all I know how to do is like, I don't even know the difference between a proc and a lambda. Like, I just like what I really wanted to tell myself then is like just like don't be scared. Like companies really want to hire people. Like this is still a very hot job market. I imagine it will continue to be a very hot job market for a while. Like, yeah, it's like not as hard as you think it is to get a job. It might take you a little while, but you can just kind of just like do it, like have some confidence. And like really just like give it a try and don't be scared. I mean, if you're coming across scared on the phone screen, like that's like actually going to kind of be a bit of a red flag. Like you need to at least pretend to be confident. Yeah, so that's my number 1 advice. My number 2 advice is get an internal referral. Those are really awesome.
Yeah, I think those are. You give us some really good tips on how to do that too, which is awesome.
Yeah, contribute to my repositories.
That might be, you might have a conflict of interest in why you would offer that advice, but
yeah,
hopefully someone will take you up on it. Well, so Peter, given that this is going to be available publicly, what would be the best way for someone to potentially reach out to you if you're open to that?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to reach out to me, you can email me. Peter@peterhurford.com. That's HURFORD. Yeah, just send me an email. Yeah. Also, peterhurford.com is my website. It is like 2 years out of date, and you should not judge me by it. Yeah, I definitely need to update that.
But it is a pretty good example of a code portfolio.
Yeah, I use that.
Site.
I use that website. I put it on my resume, and like people talked about it on my phone screen. Like they're like, "Oh, this is a pretty sweet website. Like, how'd you make it?" And then I got to like describe like how I did like some of the CSS stuff, and I got to sound like I knew what I was talking about and like talk about technology on the phone screen. I think that like definitely really helped. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And to everyone else who's here tonight and who's listening in maybe later on, thank you guys for your attention. This has been the Viking Codecast with Peter Hurford of Avant Credit at peterhurford.com. And this is our weekly Codecast, so please join us next week. And everyone, I hope you have a wonderful night, and we'll see you again in a week. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.